but I'm glad for all of you sticking with me, and also being able to troubleshoot them. By the way, week 4 is currently uploading. So hopefully, and then hopefully for those people who weren't able to be here tonight, week 5 will have, it's now recording, and we should have that up and going. Now, before we get started, do we have any sort of outstanding questions from last week? I am doing a little bit of recap. I know there's about 3 or 4 of you who weren't here last week, and I see a hand starting to come up over here, but as always, as we go, just simply stick up your hand, interrupt, that's fine, and we can go from there. So anyway, just a bit of a recap of where we've been. I don't think I need to go over this too much, because of course we're at the very end. And this is talking about really in terms of an actual time period, we're working from about 800 CE to the actual the event that is considered to have precipitated the Great Schism between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. And so that's what a lot of today is. And as I was putting this together, I realized last week I dealt a lot with the rise of Islam. I actually don't deal with it too much at all this week. So some of the questions you might have, I might have to come back and work with that. And of course, if there's any questions overall that you might have as we go, and anything that I might have missed, because this is, like I said, orbital level course. I can't believe how much I've left out. But trying to do this in 5 hour-and-a-half sessions, I suddenly realized that, boy, this is like really overdue. So hopefully we can work our way through this. So I wanted to do a bit of a little bit of a recap from just in terms of last week. And the primary things is, here are the points that I hope you came away with this, is that the Western Roman Empire officially ceased to exist after about 476 CE with when the last Roman emperor was actually deposed by the Odoacer, but of course after that, the Eastern Roman Empire that still identified itself as the Roman Empire. In fact, they said we're the official Roman Empire, even though Rome was barely in their territories. But the Eastern Roman Empire continued to be a major political player, and actually still consistently existed past our time point. We now call that the Byzantine Empire, just for clarity. But this is the Roman Empire as centered out of Constantinople. Rough territories range from the north of Africa. At its greatest extent, it did actually include what was now Italy. It also included much of North Africa, parts of Spain, and of course the dominant territories that it controlled throughout most of its existence were what is now Turkey and Greece. And of course, but the territorial difference between the largest and smallest extent of the Byzantine Empire was huge. Because under Justinian dynasty in 555, that's the territories that I named was the greatest extent. But during the 20 years anarchy, it barely covered the territory of modern-day Turkey and a little bit of Greece, and little bits and pieces of territory here and there from time to time. And that was, of course, during what was referred to as the 20 years anarchy. So the Byzantine Empire almost fell apart during this period, and it was actually at this point in time that Islam at least, the Arabs under the various surviving, or the successor caliphates to Muhammad had actually spread to their greatest extent during the 20 Years' Anarchy. And that includes right into Spain, almost in France, in terms of some of that territory. And of course, it wouldn't be until 1453 the Byzantine Empire formally was basically ceased to exist at the hands of the Ottoman Turks 400 years after we're done. So that's so to give you an idea in terms of survival, you know, we're dealing with a period of the Byzantine Empire existed as it did really for 1,000 years. And of course, the Eastern Church evolved along with it, but and the church itself established 5 centers. Of course, Rome, Constantinople being the big ones, but also in Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem. But of course, with the rise of Islam by 650 CE, you had Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem all under the control of an Islamic caliphate. Now, that having been said, the Muslims were very kind to Christians at this time. And that they, in many respects, regarded them as people of the book. And the reason that many of these Christians liked having Islam there is because they lowered their taxes, they were good for business, they celebrated knowledge, but they also gave them a certain amount of religious freedom. And that was definitely that was under the Rashidun and the Umayyad caliphates. Of course, when we get into the Crusades next year, which is not that far away, then we get into a little bit more details in terms of that, because it all depended on who was in charge, at least as far as the various caliphates and the various dynasties that ruled. But the upshot of this is that after the what are sometimes referred to as the Arab conquest, but really the spread of these Islamic dynasties, you actually had only 2 centers of Christianity, Rome and Constantinople. And that was it. I mean, there were Christians that continued to exist in these other areas, and actually, in many respects, the Alexandria, for example, allowed the Coptic Church to flourish. But it was now officially in enemy territory, so the communication back and forth just wasn't there. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But of course, they were going different. The 2 surviving were going in different directions, and that's a lot of what we're talking about today. And this is, if there's one thing to remember, this is the Eastern Church was always under the control of an emperor. The emperor in the Eastern Empire was the one that called the various ecumenical councils. You've got a disagreement, he'd call the bishops together, and they would discuss it. Of course, Rome had many of its churches outside of the Byzantine territories, and so the Western Church actually became had more and more power. In some cases, they were actually the only civil authority actually left, and that's part of tonight's discussion. And as I will reiterate later tonight, the linguistic difference between the Eastern Church and the Western Church became more and more apparent, that the Eastern Church used, and the Eastern leadership, the imperial leadership, would use Greek, and the Western Church used Latin. And for anybody who knows a little thing about, sometimes semantics and things are lost in translation. And one of the major issues between the East and West Church didn't continue, but it certainly started because of some ambiguity in translation. And this actually has to do with which version of the Nicene Creed we actually say. But I'll get to that. So, back to Rome. Now, any questions before we actually get into this in a little more detail? See, here's the thing: is that the Roman Church always claimed, it was always during this time officially connected to the larger church, including Constantinople. But remember, under the Pentarchy, namely Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem, they had, pardon me, they actually had this, they were all supposed to be, in essence, a cluster of equals. And in essence, if you had 5, more or less, when you'd have groups, like you would have, if there was a disagreement with 2, you also had the other 3 to offset them. But of course, all along, Rome, because of the tradition that Peter was the first pope. Now, whether Peter actually was the first pope is a matter for historians, but at least by this point, that tradition was widely accepted even in the Eastern Church. And Rome claimed for itself, the Roman Church claimed for itself that, in fact, that their patriarch, whom they called Pope, the patriarch would be the leader of each of the various, the 5 sees, as they were called. But the Bishop of Rome was referred to as, effectively the Patriarch of Rome was referred to as the Pope. By the way, Patriarch, it means father, Pope means father. So in fact, Patriarch and Pope are very similar, but the Western Church specifically said that the Bishop of Rome, and they used the term Pope, and for quite a while. And of course, Rome constantly rubbed it in the face of of all the other churches that we're the first among equals and wanted to be recognized as such. Imagine if you're in the other churches and this is being rubbed in your face. But of course, the other thing is that when the Western Roman Empire fell, suddenly there was a power vacuum, and the only civil institution left that actually survived that was the church. And there were many of those jurisdictions were completely outside of Roman control. Professional secret. I keep fishermen's friends in the pulpit. I think I only need half one tonight. So I'm only just going to take a half one. Because I think I've only got one left. But that should do me. So anyway, because the church was in many respects the only civil authority that was left, there were certain places within those various territories that were effectively anarchy. And the only ones to actually be able to organize was the church itself. And so there were some places where not only were they the church government, they became the civil government. In fact, there's actually several examples. If you actually look up the term Prince Bishop, and I'm not talking the cardinals being referred to as the princes of the church. I mean, there were actually effectively people who were both prince and bishop at the same time. And that led to all kinds of interesting issues. But initially, it was assumed because nobody else was doing it.
Did they have a civil militia?
Well, you see, that's where I got into some issues. Is because, yes, in fact, this was a conversation we actually had sort of outside of last week's discussion, that along with raising, not only looking after civil affairs in government, they had to raise an army to protect them. So you actually had examples of bishops raising armies in order to protect. Now, but it was reluctantly so, because they often, that wasn't really things that they had. But a little later on, more toward, after the period that we're dealing with, we actually have examples where bishops were physically in combat in really wars of aggression. And it did actually happen. But initially, they didn't really want it, but it was kind of forced on them. But over time, it becomes tradition. And suddenly, you actually have these bishops effectively getting involved in the intrigue of politics. And that's a lot of what we're talking about tonight. Yeah, I've already brought that point up. So it's a small print, but it's saying exactly what I just said. So in some of these jurisdictions, bishops were effectively princes of city-states. But they actually did have a certain degree of, not a certain degree, that they were genuinely the civil authority, more so than they were religious authority. And of course, with this, the Roman Church gained a lot of power. And unfortunately, with politics, there is a risk of corruption. And this is going to get really dark. But of course, now keep in mind, we live in an age where we have instant communication to anywhere on the planet. Virtually anywhere on the planet. I can pull out my iPhone and potentially text someone in Central Africa and get a response. Communication was done by horse on roads that were presumed to be safe. The trouble is, especially when you moved east, or sorry, when you moved west, after the collapse of the civil government, you suddenly had multiple jurisdictions, and the highway bandits were much more common. So communication between east and west became much more difficult. It was still there, but it was much more difficult. Now, that having been said, even under, if you actually look at some of the maps of the day, Rome itself actually remained under Byzantine control for quite some time. Although there was a period from Odoacer in through the kingdom of the Ostrogoths, where it was under control of Germanic tribes or Germanic kingdoms. But after the Justinian dynasty, they actually managed to reclaim some of those territories. But even with that reclamation, you had all of what is now France, most of what is now Germany, certainly all of what is England, that remained completely outside of Byzantine control. They weren't even on the map. But that's where the Roman Church was. And of course, with the waning of the power of the Byzantine Empire, because of that, it just fluctuated so much that they couldn't rely on protection from Constantinople. So they had to look for other sources. And one of the major events that helped move the church further and further to be aligned to the West was under Pope Stephen II, is you actually had, the trouble is, Italy was being invaded by another Germanic tribe called the Lombards. You might have heard of them, or you might have heard there are places there's a place in Europe that's actually named after it. The trouble is, the Lombards were Arian. The ones that were Christian were Arian Christians, and so the Roman Church then appealed to the Germanic tribes, the Franks, north of the Alps. Can you please help us? And by doing that, and to which they agreed, eventually this created that major power shift. And of course, the huge milestone was Christmas Day 800. Is you have the crowning of Charlemagne as the emperor of a united, what at that time was the Carolingian Empire, but what would later become known as the Holy Roman Empire. The trouble is, some of these, to call it the Holy Roman Empire at the time, even though functionally that is what it was, because the term that Pope Leo III actually used was crowned him Roman Emperor. But the actual term Holy Roman Empire didn't actually become really codified until nearly 350 years later. But what this did, this was a mark at this point, huge. This event right here was major. Because after this point, no emperor in the West was crowned by anybody other than the Pope. So suddenly you had this extra-national body who had to give their consent to who was emperor, emperor or king, regardless of where they were. So in essence, you had the Roman Church was effectively overseer of these kingdoms. Now, it's much more complicated than that, actually. Now, here's the other thing. Is Constantinople didn't like this very much. And when I say it wasn't just the church, but of course, the Byzantine Empire was a rival to the Frankish kings. They had actually looked at expanding into Eastern Europe, and the Franks had repelled them. So, in essence, you actually had a part of their own church allying with the enemy. So it was seen as a power play, and it probably was a power play, but a power play perhaps born out of a certain degree of need, because the Byzantines were too weak to help the Roman Church from various the various kingdoms moving, doing their own power plays around them. But of course, as I mentioned before, after this point, the church became the legitimizing force, or the legitimizing institution behind any monarchy in Western Europe.
Whose decision was it to have the Pope? Was it Charlemagne's decision to have the Pope crown him, or was it the Pope's decision to crown him? But was it like the secular side, or the religious side?
Well,
Or
no. I think it's a good question. I mean, I've seen things that said that Charlemagne, had he known that this is what the Pope was up to, probably would have refused it. And I think there's a story that he kind of snuck up behind and shoved the crown on his head. But treat that with a certain degree of skepticism, because it was done in Rome on Christmas Day. It wasn't just here, come over, have a beer, get you drunk, and throw a crown on you. Might have been some of that in play, by the way. And wait till you get to some of the names that we get into a little bit later. But curiously enough, by doing this, you actually had this almost symbiotic relationship, particularly with the Germanic Empire, specifically the what would become the Holy Roman Empire, and the church in Rome. But the relationship, you see, if you could say the relationship in the Western Church was you had effectively the legitimizing force being the church over various empires. In the West, in the East, you had the church serving the purposes of the empire. So you had empire over church, church over empires plural. You know, that if there's a contrast to remember, it's the near opposites with that. The trouble is, it's not quite that clear cut. Because once people began to realize that if the Pope has say over who's the emperor, guess where the intrigue started to happen? So, again, this is what I often get ahead of myself, so this is just reiterating what I've already said. And what's the problem? And you've heard this line. Power tends to corrupt. Oh boy, does it ever. Okay. The trouble with doing a course like this is it does really need to be warts and all. The trouble is I'm not getting to all the warts. This is just the cancer seen from orbit, okay? But it's bad. So you have churches on both sides being completely enmeshed in the politics. You have, I mean, if you ever heard the term Byzantine politics, I mentioned this last time, is that the church was heavily involved in the court intrigue of the Byzantine Empire. That was part and parcel of it. But they were always subject to it. In the West, you had the church effectively over a number of different kingdoms and a number of different empires. But at the same time, effectively, the intrigue then, not so much with the various kingdoms, although that absolutely did happen, it was who controlled the papacy. Whoever controlled the papacy effectively controlled Europe. So corruption, if there was a scale of weight between corruption in the Eastern Church and corruption in the Western Church would have outweighed them 10 to 1. Not to say that the Eastern Church didn't have issues of corruption on their own, but it paled in comparison to what was happening in the Roman Church. And it was actually so bad. See, initially they started to, power was kind of foisted upon them when there was a vacuum left. But by the time that 861 rolled around, it's kind of like, we like this. Too much. And, you see, now, have any of you ever seen the miniseries The Borgias? Okay, I haven't. But I can say with a certain degree of conclusion that the corruption level of the church at this point in time in history made the Borgias look practically angelic. Okay? And I'm hearing some, here's where we're getting into that. Admittedly, I'm not as aware of this, but some of the stuff that was going on here. Now, this is the depressing part. Especially for those of you who are like me, who know the church, who love the church. Like, holy cow, this is awful. We need to get through the awful. So here are just some examples. And again, this is the cancer from orbit. So, one of the things that the modern method of selecting popes, what is called conclave, did not exist until 1059, after our time period. Very shortly after our time period, but still after our time period. Most of the time, popes were either selected by their predecessors, designated as such. There was sometimes sort of a nominal election, but quite often it was people in power that selected them. Certainly that was the practice in the Byzantine Empire and the Roman Empire broadly before it, is that, in essence, the emperor picked who was next. The Western Empire it was a lot more complicated. And quite often it fell to whoever actually controlled Rome itself. And so the control of the papacy actually fell under the control of families that actually were in charge of Rome itself. How's that for a term? This is of course a later term, but there was a period, especially from 906 to 963, so this is a huge period of time that was referred to as a plenocracy. Okay, and they're not exaggerating here. Apparently, one of the popes, I'm not going to name which one, but one of them actually held orgies, or it was said to have held orgies in the palace in what is now the Vatican. Now, not the current building, but that was built during the Renaissance. That was much later. But in this time, he was under the control. At that particular time, he was under the control of one family. They were the ones who were able to pick basically who was pope. And if they could control who was pope, they could then control, in essence, be able to exert control and pressure on the other powers throughout Europe. But in this time, there were 12, there were a whole series of popes. 12 of them were killed, 3 deposed, 2 abdicated during this time. So, in a very short period of time, so you're looking at under 60 years, you have 17 popes. And it seems that a bomber pilot in World War II had a longer lifespan. And, of course, one of the things, during this particular period, 3 of the popes were actual members of this particular family. Curiously enough, even after the Theophylacti family was effectively deposed, there ended up being about 2 more from that family who ended up being popes in the succeeding years. But their influence was incredibly strong during this period of time. And the trouble is, when it got bad, eventually the Crescenti family came after, and all they did was depose the Theophylacti family effectively from power, but they started doing the same thing. Their excesses weren't necessarily as much, but they were certainly there. But they were there for a shorter period of time, and the Tusculans from 1012 to 1048. Basically, these were the families that controlled Rome, therefore they controlled the papacy, and therefore they had great influence over the entirety of the various states that the Pope oversaw.
I don't know my dates at all, but when was it in this period where they had 2, 3 popes at one time?
Okay, the official answer to that question is yes. Because there were other times when there were also...
Because there was a time that the Pope was appointed by the King of France.
Yes, and that was later. That was later. In fact, that is referred to as the Great Schism that wasn't the Great Schism. We're talking about the Great Schism here, but there was another one where you actually had 2 popes. But it was all politics. In fact, some of these popes were not priests before they were made pope.
Do you mind repeating your question?
Oh, sorry. Bonnie's question was she had heard that there was a time where there was more than one pope at the same time. Is this that time period? Or did it come later? The official answer to that question is yes, because during this time there were some who were pope, and then not pope, and then pope again, and then not pope. That they were deposed and then put back, and it got really complicated. But there was a time late after this period where the King of France appointed a pope, versus the papacy in Rome, and so that was referred to as the Great Schism. That wasn't really a schism. Well, it was a schism, but I mean compared to what we're dealing with tonight. This wasn't the Great Schism. Thank you.
First of all, we were back there, and the emperors
actually, that's not quite true. In the East, you had emperors effectively appointing popes. Now, that's a gross oversimplification, but that's kind of, they were appointing the patriarchs. Okay. In the West, you actually had, with the result of Charlemagne, no emperor was crowned without the Pope's approval. What you actually have here is not emperors, but a family in and around the papal states, just in and around Rome. They had no official political or military influence beyond the states around Rome itself. But they controlled Rome, therefore they controlled who was bishop of Rome. Because that became part of it. And so they were extending influence well beyond their actual borders. And the trouble is, it didn't really get much better. Because here, the rule of these families in and around the Roman states actually came to an end with Henry III. That Henry III installed a German as a pope, actually, before he became the emperor. It's kind of complicated. But he appoints, when he was effectively the king of some of the smaller states within the Holy Roman Empire. Henry III in 1046 appoints Pope Clement II. Then Pope Clement II installs Henry III in 1047 as emperor. And then after that, then Henry III until 1059 would be appointing popes. And 1059 is actually when the papacy managed to wrest itself from that control, and this is actually where the conclave, as we now know it, starts. So there was a Reformation movement kind of starting. We kind of get to that a little bit. So anyway, there's just part of what I've already, this is just reiterating what I've already said. Now, here's the thing. There's a particular crime that was fairly common or something that was understood as a crime, kind of. Does anybody know what signing is? Signing, this word right here. Effectively, it's bribery to a church. In other words, in essence, you're basically paying, you're buying an office. And during what was referred to as the Pornocracy, there were many popes that were appointed because they paid enough money to the right people to become pope. And there was one instance where someone was deposed, and then the one who was deposed went back to the same people who deposed them and said, "I'll pay you more," and was reinstalled. Yuck. Really, really yuck. But, as I mentioned before, 1059 is when the current practice of the papal enclave done by cardinals allowed the papacy to become, to a certain degree, more independent. Because from here on in, nobody, and they tried, France, for example, tried to install their own pope. The popes, you see, as the practice is today, popes themselves name cardinals. Cardinals themselves are, you see, I think we were talking last week in terms of the various roles. You have bishop, archbishop. Cardinals themselves, the cardinal title was given to the people who would participate in conclave. And so you could have cardinal priests, you could have cardinal bishops, cardinal archbishops, but they all sort of had that special role of selecting the pope. Now I saw, Peg, you had a hand up. Lonnie, was there a hand over there? Okay.
So when the cardinals, these people were going around buying the pope, could the cardinals not buy their position, by giving lots of money to the pope? So how does that make the cardinals any more less corrupt than the pope?
Well, you see, that's where, the corruption shifted from there potentially into the conclave. And I mean, the practice of conclave in terms of how they actually do it still had to evolve over time to be able to kind of excise that level of corruption. And I mean, sometimes because the distances traveled and messages traveled and things getting mixed up, sometimes you only actually had seven people actually participating in conclave. But here's the other thing is that cardinals eventually became that they weren't allowed to vote for themselves. They actually had to vote, they had to vote for someone else. But it did become by private ballot. It's actually remarkably democratic, despite the fact that they handpicked. Now, the thing is, the cardinals are allowed to pick someone who is not one of their own number to be the next pope, by the way. Now, it's been ages since that last happened, like 800 years since that last happened, but it has happened. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. But this was actually a real starting point in terms of reviving the church. But you see, notice the date. It's actually outside of our official sphere. So by the time we finish with this isn't installed yet. So now here's the other thing is, this is one thing where I wasn't exactly sure where to put it, but with civil power also comes the case of what to do in legal cases in terms of justice in from crimes anywhere from theft to murder to these things that they have to be responsible for. But as part of that, unfortunately, one of the things that is characterized by the Middle Ages is this, heretics were burnt all the time. You go into a town and see, that's not exactly true. Unfortunately, a lot of it did happen, but mostly after the time period that we're working with. But it started just towards the end of our time period. And the earliest known example where actually heretics were burned alive was in 1022 in Orleans. And it turns out it was actually a political fight between the King of France and the Count de Groix. And in essence, it was done as an effort to embarrass the King of France, and and unfortunately, it was about 14 people that were basically called out that were actually had some degree of influence in the King of France. This was done through intrigue, but it wasn't religious authorities that actually did the burning. But you see, the whole point is, it was who could appoint the bishop. Now, remember how I said at this point in time, bishops were still being appointed, not by the Pope, but by the local authorities. And that actually continued for quite some time. That Rome didn't manage to gain that kind of power back for quite some time. Mind you, this is still before 1059 anyway. But unfortunately what it did is it set up a very dangerous precedent, because burning was a punishment reserved for witches. But here's a little bit, and I put this in very intentionally in small writing. Did you know that in 785 there was edicts on the part of the church itself that burning of witches was outlawed? In fact, if you burnt somebody because you thought they were a witch, you were actually under sanction and would receive a death penalty if you did that. Because witchcraft did not exist as far as the church was concerned. There are no such thing as witches. Two hundred fifty odd years later, things begin to change, and for bad. Because curiously enough, the concept of burning witches was something that actually came in along with largely the Germanic tribes. And, these were from earlier, they were actually, these were polytheistic. The concept, the trouble is we have a different concept of what witches and witchcraft are. Someone who practices magic is a sorcerer. A witch is someone who is just a blight on the community, at least in terms of this idea, and certainly through those witches were effectively scapegoats. Witchcraft, whether someone was actually truly a witch and practicing witchcraft, became a later construction. And that was, but unfortunately what happened in Orleans is it suddenly equated being a heretic with being a witch. Which was not, the thing is that was not true at all. But that's how some of the hysteria began to build with it. And of course, a lot of this comes out of that the power corrupts. But these executions, at least initially, were done by civil authorities. And of course, the 11th and 12th century, after our period here, that's when the real ugly stuff of the Middle Ages and that reputation of witches being burned at the stake or heretics being burned at the stake would happen after this London.
Why did they choose burning?
That's a very good question. Near as I can figure is that fire is seen as a cleansing thing, aside from the fact that it's horribly painful. And if there was ever an execution method that was actually worse than crucifixion, it would probably be burning. But the idea is that perhaps it was seen as a purification. Quite sort of in eras previous to this, or this was the first time anybody was actually burned alive, as far as we're aware, at least in this context. I mean, the various, you can find atrocities all over every empire in history where burning was included. But at least from the church's perspective, if someone was deemed a heretic sort of after the fact, sometimes their ashes were dug up and then they were executed and then the body was burned. Effectively cremated after the fact. Keep in mind that cremation at this particular point in time in the church's history, and even up to today, that because of the concept of the resurrection of the body, if your body was burned, apparently God couldn't resurrect you if you were ashes. And so that was seen as effectively a very effective post-mortem punishment. So,
Witches are women?
not exclusively, no.
Okay.
I mean, sometimes you get into the term witches, warlocks, and things like that. But basically, the context of what a witch was in the Middle Ages, particularly after this point, became very different from what it initially was. But unfortunately, even though witches weren't exclusively women, most often they were. And some of that has to do with misogyny and these kinds of things that existed in those cultures and sort of continued through. But unfortunately, that did seem to be the case. But certainly the people that were burned in Orleans, more than half of them were men. Probably about, I think, 3/4 were men in this particular case. So now, this is the part I've been wanting to get to. It hasn't that's what we've been up to this point been really depressing. If you don't think it's depressing, let's go back and cover it again, and then get more depressed, and then come back to this. There's always the question is, with all this intrigue and all this politics going on, where on earth is Jesus in all this? Because we've been talking about how the church has evolved, and it's come to a point where it is almost completely unrecognizable from this movement that started on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Where were the faithful? At least at this point in time, this is where the historian goes, show me where the faithful are, and they were there. Because Christianity's spread had actually not very much to do with who was in control of the politics. It made it easier for them to exist, but then again, keep in mind, for the first 300 years of Christianity's existence, it grew just fine. Personal contact. And a lot of Christianity's spread, even into the Middle Ages, was personal contact. Relationship building. Not on who had the swords, and not who had the castles, not who controlled the Pope. It was individual contact. And the thing is, I think this is the encouraging part, is that in spite of the yuck that was there in terms of church history, and we fully need to acknowledge that, there was this sense of genuinely faithful people who were there, who wanted to make the world a better place, and worked from their best understanding. And again, it was kindness. That's how the church spread, not by sword. And on occasion, you actually had a certain nobles who themselves were enamored by what that offered, and themselves were very faithful. Many of them gave up of their titles and became monks. Some of them, on the other hand, it was done for a little bit more selfish purpose, and let's lean back into the dark stuff again, is that basically they would set up a monastery or a church as long as they would pray for me so I can go to heaven. I'll do all this bad stuff, but as long as they're praying for me, that's my get out of hell free card. Many nobles, that's exactly what they did. But there was one in particular. There were a few of these, but one in particular was a guy by the name of William I, Duke of Aquitaine, founded an abbey under the Benedictine rule that had been established under St. Benedict many years before. And this was, remember when I told you about the monasteries? And he established a monastery that was not accountable to him. He said, I do not want control of this abbey. You are accountable to Rome. Naive boy. But because of that, the establishment of the Benedictine Abbey in Cluny, which apparently you can go and visit today in eastern France, he didn't want any control over the abbey. He said, his personal devotion was his personal devotion. He took his faith seriously. And for that reason, while he initially set it up and appointed the first abbot, he then took his hands off and set it up in the charter of this particular monastery, that it is not accountable to me as the Duke of Aquitaine, nor the King of France, but directly to Rome. And, like I said, he appointed the first abbot. By the way, abbot, the leader of it. And the whole idea was to rededicate themselves to the Benedictine rule, which was a fairly strict ascetic life in a community, in study and faith. And, of course, here's the thing. Not only did they make it accountable to the Pope, they actually built in this charter that anybody who interfered with this would go to hell. But the thing is, keep in mind, this is a very superstitious age. Someone builds in a curse into a contract. They took it seriously. Now, here's the thing. With all the stuff that was going on in Rome at this particular time, Rome didn't care. So really, as long as there was a certain payment that the abbey had to make to Rome every 5 years, which really wasn't very much. As long as they did that, Rome left them alone. And this allowed this community and communities that formed out of this to flourish. And this, if you've ever heard of the term the Cluniac Reforms, this was a way in which the church began to renew itself within. And this was huge. At one time, this was the most influential religious movement in Europe because it was a grassroots operation, effectively. And the strictness of the now, have any of you ever been to a Benedictine monastery? If I may ask, where was it? In Greece. Okay. You don't actually have to go all the way to Greece to find a Benedictine monastery these days. In fact, I think there is even one out west. The one, my favorite, actually the only one I've been to, but my favorite, is a place called Westminster Abbey in Mission, BC. And they're right on top of the mountain. And Benedictines are very good at hospitality. And you can, and I've done full-on silent retreats where you go in and you shut up for a week. Now, I only imagine a weekend, actually, but it was lovely. Prayer, silence, solitude is very, very much a part of the Benedictine rule. But you see, they also looked at establishing safe spaces. You know the whole idea of the concept of sanctuary. This is really where, now the sanctuary movement, or it was called the peace of God, sort of developed separately, but the Cluny Reforms really adopted this and said, we need to provide safe space for people who, it was to try and reduce the violence inherent in the feudal system. And that's what they wanted to do, is provide these safe spaces. And curiously enough, the threat of hell was very good. Because anybody who attacked the church or attacked the poor, it was basically instant excommunication. Now, excommunication didn't mean you were burnt at the stake. It just meant that you had to do a penitential rite to regain God's favor. But what it did is actually provided protection for the people who are the most vulnerable in society. And again, it's like all that yuck stuff, and then this is going on, where they are trying to build protection for people. They also encouraged pilgrimages, go to the Holy Land or other holy sites. Personal piety and devotion became part of this. Now, the thing is, the Cluniac Reforms actually did continue past the period that we're in. And eventually, as with any movement, unfortunately, sometimes it begins to fall into intrigue and the yuck. But what was really fascinating about this is that it seemed to be built in, that, and this was not intentional, it just seemed to be a fairly natural evolution, is that the beauty of worship was one big thing about the Cluniac Reforms. And eventually, the beauty of worship meant that churches got very, very much, that's where the gold, and all of a sudden they became very rich. You wanted a gold chalice for communion. There was a lot of wealth that began to flow in. Of course, wealth begins to corrupt. And so, for example, in the 11th century, after the period that we're talking about, there were a group of Benedictines that said, we need to get back to that Benedictine rule. And they, without exaggeration, founded a monastery on a swamp. I hear a Monty Python scheme, a Monty Python skit from the Holy Grail kind of coming to mind. We built a castle on that swamp, and it sank. And we built another one, and it sank. Built a third one, that one stayed. It was kind of that order. But that's where this new monastic order called the Cistercians emerged. And then generations later, you had the Franciscans emerge. In many respects, they were always, even though the Cluny reforms eventually began to represent the excesses of the church eventually, there were always these renewal movements that managed to continue. And in many respects, this also laid a foundation for what eventually would be the Reformation as well. The church was constantly trying to renew itself from the ground up. And they did, at its height, the Cluniac reforms did find influence all the way to Rome. And it was one of the things that eventually pushed the papal the creation of the conclave, the independence of the church from civil authorities.
I have two questions. I get the feeling of a lot of fragmentation through this period, and yet there was a coordination which put it all together at some stage. That's the one question, and maybe the second one thanks to that. Who was the Cluniac movement? Who put that together, provided the drive, and was that what created the coordination?
Well, I think one of the things, like the Cluniac reforms they're called the Cluniac because they started in the Queen of Cluny. It would not have started if it wasn't for this Duke, the Duke of Aquitaine, actually founding this in his territory and saying, I don't want any part of it. You see, that was a huge difference, because many other dukes and counts founded abbeys, but they kept their finger in the pie. He didn't want his finger in the pie, and that's what allowed them a certain degree of freedom. The person he appointed was a very devout Benedictine who wanted to reestablish that strict rule. And by doing that, all of a sudden they found that there were more and more people that were attracted to that. So that initial drive that let's go back a slide. Berno of Beaune was the one who actually created the environment, because he was the founding abbot of the abbey in Cluny. But he also managed to establish it that that those who succeeded him were committed to the Benedictine rule. And it was out of that, the beauty of worship, the appreciation, silence, prayer, hospitality, and peace, really, providing safe. And people felt safe around that. So again, this comes back to how did Christianity spread? It actually was more through this kind of activity than any sort of high-level political activity. So does that answer your question? Or?
Yeah, how did that actually have the result of pulling Christianity together in at least the Western?
Well, part of it was the people in general were sick and tired of the high-level politics and intrigue. Certainly, there were those in the church there were those in the church who were kind of caught up in the politics and didn't see it. But there were others who still had a certain degree of influence and said, you know what? This is where we need to be. And eventually, slowly, that movement gained a lot of social power, I think would be the best degree of it. And the Cluniac, what are called the Cluniac reforms, effectively renewed or reformed the Western Church, so that the element of the pornocracy, for example, by the time that the Cluniac reforms had moved its way through, that was effectively it managed to sweep that away.
It seems that the monasteries were driving it.
Yes, the monasteries were. Yes,
I just sort of picture that huge area where there was Christianity, and what was the network that kept all these monasteries in touch with one another, so that there was a new, a kind of a new leadership movement.
Yeah, well, you see, many of the monasteries actually fell under the control of individual bishops, and you still had the way in which the church was organized by regions, or what were referred to as dioceses, and the bishop was over top of that. There was, even though the monastery, for example, in Cluny, was only officially accountable to Rome, they were still very much in contact with those around them. And so that's how a lot of this word spread. I mean, because you have Benedictines going from one monastery to another Benedictine monastery, because they had the Benedictine rule as their core, document in terms of identifying that. And so they were. They were permitted to travel even between rival kingdoms, because that was, and so a lot of the ideas spread through the monasteries, because the monasteries were also places where if you wanted to find people who were literate, that's what largely were, not exclusively, but largely were.
You mentioned Rome here.
Yes.
So would it be that Rome through this period was actually the pillar of all things still?
Well, it was still perceived. It was still perceived as such, but in many respects, this movement actually started in France and then moved down and spread throughout the Western Empire. Eventually, and by the time that it got to Rome, it effectively Rome was swept along for the ride, and frankly for the better. So effectively, this was a grassroots movement that eventually reformed the church. Here's the other thing is that the concept of clerical celibacy, if you understand what was going on in Rome, particularly like these days, particularly in Protestant church, we look at clerical celibacy as quaint, and we look down on it. The trouble is, this was a way to reestablish a lot of the bad stuff that was going on during the pornocracy. You know, like it was aptly named. You know, there was a lot of sex going on, and not for good. You know, and this was during, it was part of the Cluniac reforms that actually made it so that it wasn't just monks who were celibate, but all priests became celibate as a way to bring a lot of that under control. Now, as we know, for example, from the Borgias, it didn't always happen, but it happened less after this. Now, of course, these days, clerical celibacy is actually pointed at as an unhealthy thing. The unfortunate reality of pedophilia in not just the Roman Catholic Church, but that's predominantly where it's been, but throughout the church in terms of abuse of power, has led us to rethink that in a certain degree. But at the time, clerical celibacy was seen as a way of bringing a lot of that dysfunction under control, and so that's why it came into place. And curiously enough, that was really established in the West. The East wasn't. The East didn't have that. Wasn't quite that hung up about it. So now, have I answered your question? Because sometimes I'll take a question, run with it, and not actually answer the question. So I just want to make sure that you're okay with the answer. But of course, most of the impact of the Cluniac reforms would actually come after the time period that we're dealing with. But it was in our time period here, really, it would only be just ever so slightly past. I mean, we're talking, like count on my hand number of years, where the worst successes, the church was past the worst of its successes, but it wasn't suddenly ding and it's great again. There were still issues of corruption going on, even like right up until it contributed to the in terms of the split. So we're going to go back east for a little bit. Just keep in final time, and actually we're doing fairly well. And of course, this part, the Byzantine Empire was never as strong as it ever was under in terms of its overall time. It never regained the territory that it did under the Justinian dynasty. And under this time period, most of it was referred to as the Macedonian dynasty, that the rulers were originally, could trace their origins to what we now call Macedonia. But, and they did manage to hold their own against the Umayyads, which the Umayyad dynasty, and for those of you who weren't here last year, the Umayyads were the, at least at the time, the caliphate that was in control of the territories that were the conquered or where when Islam was founded, and then over a period of 100 years expanded, including into virtually all of Spain. And so they managed to regain some of the territory, but also keep in mind, kingdoms being kingdoms what they are, even though it's called a caliphate, and caliph means steward, it was still a functioning kingdom. And any political entity, no matter what the religious background is, has intrigue. And while I'm not getting into it, the Umayyads eventually, through intrigue, effectively became under the control of the Abbasids. And so the Byzantine Empire was actually able to exploit some of the weakness in the same way that the early caliphates, the Rashidids, had managed to wipe out so much of their territory that they managed to kind of push back the frontier a little bit. And it turns out that they often sent spies into into territory to kind of disrupt things, and that's where that whole line about Byzantine politics would come up. They were actually trying to actively keep them off balance by keeping, if they were fighting with themselves, they were fighting us. That was the whole idea behind it. So they did manage to kind of hold them back at least a little bit. Of course, the church itself was occupied with internal matters, particularly the discussion of iconoclasm, which we talked about last week, came up again. And that's the whole idea, is the worship of worship of God using icons appropriate? And there was another period in the Eastern Church where it rose up again, largely between about 814 and about 860-ish, where that was it. Eventually, of course, that the those who liked icons, the iconodules, won over the iconoclasts. And that's one of the reasons why, if you go into an Eastern Orthodox church, you do see these glorious icons. You have, and if anything, they probably have it better than the Roman Catholics do. But the Roman Church never liked this whole debate over iconoclasm. They practically ignored it. But from the Byzantine point of view, is that the emperor wanted it resolved because they felt that the Byzantine Empire had lost faith with God. And they were trying to renew themselves from the top down. It was a difference. The Cluniac reforms was from the ground up. This was an attempt to renew themselves from the top down. It didn't work as well. But at this point in time, you actually had now, the Western Church was almost entirely speaking in Latin, and the Eastern Church almost entirely in Greek. Now, how many of you can read Greek? How many of you can read Latin? Okay, a few more hands. One of the big barriers between, and the thing is, chances are most of you, if you were to sit down and try to read Latin, you could manage, even though you don't speak a word of it. Okay, partly because if you've done any sort of scientific research, Latin names are fairly common. Two, Latin uses something called the Roman alphabet, and that's what we use, is the Roman alphabet. So that's still consistent. Greeks, it's Greek to me, literally, and it's a completely different alphabet. So not only do you have differences in language and nuance, and Greek is a nuance-filled language. And so you have the potential differences in translations. And when you have people who aren't really interested in the other's language, that becomes a problem. And here's the other thing, is that the Roman Church making deals with the Franks was of course not seen well by the rulers of the Byzantine Empire, because they were the enemy. I mentioned this before. But the Church of Constantinople also, because they were so well aligned with the emperors in the Byzantine Empire, that they didn't exactly like this either. Even to the point where even before this alignment with the Franks, when it did start to happen earlier than Charlemagne, but even before that, the antagonism between the two were so bad that it was the Emperor Leo. Keep in mind, not a church, but an emperor said, you know what? The territory of Rome is not going to be Greece anymore. That's going to belong to Constantinople. And they just basically pushed back the border. And so the Roman Church said, fine, we've got, from here to Spain. Works for us. But, needless to say, there were some pretty hard feelings around that. And, of course, the Byzantine Church was very much focused on themselves. It was effectively navel-gazing. All this is, of course, happening while the Western Church is literally broken up. And I mentioned about the iconoclasm being an irritant. That was fine. And of course, the power of the Byzantine Church depended entirely on the fortunes of the Byzantine Empire. Today, we actually have multiple what are referred to Orthodox churches. That's spreading out into particularly Slavic territories. Didn't actually happen until later. Now, when it happened, they met with actually quite great success. And one of the reasons why the Eastern Orthodox churches, at least, are as present as they are still today, is because of that, but not at this particular point in time. They were still tied to the Byzantine Empire. And so, of course, did I remember that the Roman Church basically were jerks? Me first, we're all equals, but I'm first. That's basically, can you imagine how irritating that was? But this was a constant thing is, well, Peter was the first pope, so we need to be recognized first. Us, me, I. And of course, on the other hand, the Eastern Church said, oh, we need to discuss this in council. And we'll get into a council and start discussing things. And the Roman Church said, we don't care. And then, of course, you now have the Western Church dealing with those barbarians. Never mind that many of the people in the church were barbarians in terms of their Germanic descent. So it's becoming more and more apparent that they're moving in very different directions. Now, here's something. Now, I wanted to try and keep away from theological debate as much as I possibly could. But this thing here, called the Filioque, was actually a fairly major sticking point. Because now, how many of you actually have memorized the Nicene Creed? Okay. I am sitting on my hands because I need a copy of it in front of me. The Apostles' Creed, fine. Even the United Church's New Creed, which was written in 1968, I'm getting better at that. For those of you who don't know, I'm actually an expat Presbyterian. So, but what happened was, in the translation of the Nicene Creed from Greek into Latin, there was this insertion of in reference to the Holy Spirit, that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. That's how it was translated into Latin. But the thing is, in Greek, it said the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. Somewhere in there, this ended up getting inserted into Latin. The Eastern Church wasn't too happy about this. And it might sound like splitting hairs, but it's kind of like, well, they did all that work, but some of it was, the Greeks were much more about nuance, and you see Latin said, well, you know, it's kind of like, it falls into place. Why is this a big deal? But it certainly was a big deal that the filioque is that from the Son, is what that means. For those of you who know Latin better than I do, but that's what it means. But that was inserted into that particular line in the creed in translation, but it was officially recognized in the Roman Church in 1014. The church in Constantinople, the Eastern Church, wasn't all that keen. So that became another, like, because it had been used in Latin that way since the 6th century. You know, it was just common use. It really wasn't a big deal. But of course, the Orthodox, it was a huge deal. So all of this is creating the recipe for what's going to happen. And the two surviving sees, of course, the Roman See, or as the Romans like to call it, the Holy See, because we're it. And the Constantinople See were the two surviving ones because Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria were under Islamic control. Now, they did actually continue in some way, shape, or form. But they were largely outside of this conversation. So, what happened was, in 1053, the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, one name of Michael I I can't pronounce that. Sorry, it's one of those things that there's too many L's and too many R's in it. And for those of you who study linguistics, that's actually very difficult to say. And I practiced it earlier today, and my tongue is not working tonight. That name, there. Closed all of the Latin churches in Constantinople. All of the Latin-speaking, Latin-rite churches in Constantinople, he shut them down. But he didn't do it arbitrarily, because what was happening is that in the churches in Rome, that any Greek-speaking ones, they said, okay, you either got to close or do the Latin rite. And to try and resolve the matter, well, actually, you would think that someone would send a delegation to resolve the matter peacefully. No, that's not what happened. Pope Leo IX sent a delegation, papal legate. You know, you get the term delegate. That's a papal legate is basically a delegate from the Pope. Or a delegation from the Pope. And they said, all right, if you're going to close them, we're going to refuse you the title of the ecumenical patriarch, and you need to recognize the Pope. So instead of saying, hey, can we talk about this, it's kind of like they came in with a hammer, sent this delegation, said, here are our demands. You need to recognize this, you need to recognize this. This is what you need to do. The hitches, the delegation wasn't actually sent there just to read the riot act to the ecumenical patriarch over this issue. Really, around this time, the Normans had become very active in Europe, and you might have understood, 1066, the Battle of Hastings wasn't too far off. Well, I didn't realize this, but they were also invading Italy, the south end of it. So you have them. Normandy, up in northern France, and they're also trying to establish a foothold in Italy, and they were actually looking for help. The Papal States were saying, so they were making an appeal to the Byzantine Emperor for help, at the same time being really, really nasty to the ecumenical patriarch. Some of you might remember this is where we actually started. But here's a little bit more, and this is a bit more background. So what do you think happens next? If you were the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, and you were presented with these demands, how would you react? With a great big fat middle finger. And needless to say, basically they started giving each other the finger. And so the leader of the papal legate, the delegation, excommunicated the ecumenical patriarch of the Church of Constantinople. And of course, the ecumenical patriarch turns around and does exactly the same thing back. Curiously enough, here's the interesting thing. What happened here actually didn't have any legal foundation at all. But as far as they were concerned, it did. Because, first off, Pope Leo died while the cardinal was on his way to Constantinople. So technically, he did not have the authority to walk into that church and to excommunicate the patriarch. And the flip side is that the excommunication that the ecumenical patriarch did was only to the actual delegation itself. You guys are being such jerks, you're excommunicated until we can resolve this. Is ultimately what that meant. So you had really, there was a personal conflict that exploded into something that the church has never officially recovered from. It would become worse during the Crusades, but I'm saving that until we do the Crusades. But 1054 is when you can actually mark that there was a genuine the split. But the thing is, as you can see, the split had been growing for years. From as early as 476, if not earlier, that split was growing and growing. And this is just where it came to a head. And unfortunately, cooler heads were not present to work it out. So, here's a couple of things that I hope you take away from the whole course. This is my summary of the points to remember. This one, if nothing else, despite all of the yuck and the politics that we dealt with, the reason Christianity spread was personal contact, the message that everyone mattered, that eternal life was available to all, freely given. It was through personal contact, not by political imposition. The church, Christianity, had to establish what they had understood and believed in a sea of competing ideas. All kinds of different ideas. And they tried to establish a sense of identity. So one of the things that often, creeds are often seen as dogmatic, as in, this is what we believe, and you're either in or you're out. That's how they've been abused. They were established initially, if you understand the story behind it, is that it was said to be able to say that in this sea of competing ideas, this is what we believe. This is who we are. And you're welcome to join us. But we live in a world that is tangible. This is God's world. It isn't this whole material and spiritual difference. No, we believe in God who came and physically lived among us. And each of you matter. And of course, for those of you who are in science, each of you are matter. Unless you're traveling at the speed of light and they have energy. But anyway. So, the creeds were developed, if you understand the stories of the creeds, then you begin to understand they were developed not in a vacuum, they're not some, imposition, but a genuine discussion as to what we genuinely believe. Later, they would become, effectively, weapons. But in their origins, were not. Now, the spread of Christianity might have become easier, of course, when it achieved official status. But of course, if they did, it became the real issue is that when Christians, or at least those within a church structure became involved in politics, the politics dominated, not the faith. And so the dangers of mixing religion, if anything come out of this, the whole separation of church and state is a good idea that would come many years later, emerged out of this bad experience. And of course that, and we wouldn't eventually see that until, you know, and in many, where it would become enshrined in the constitutions of republics as they emerged out of the post-Renaissance. It came out of the experience of what happens when religion gets too mixed up and too enmeshed in politics. Let's see, do I have any more? The other thing is, despite all the politicking going on, there were always a faithful court. I'd like to, from a theological point of view, I'd like to say that the Holy Spirit continues to move in and reform the church from the church, and I mean in terms of the faith, not the institution, from the core up. But also, the one thing is, I hope this serves as a cautionary tale, and also it gives a background into where we're headed next. That's Crusades. Now, are there any other questions at this point in time? I mean, one of the warnings I will give you is that the Crusades is a very dark period of time. If anything, I need you to get into a dark sense of humor, because that's how we have to deal with it. If you can, go watch Monty Python's The Holy Grail, please. That's your homework. Go watch Monty Python. And the reason for it is that, of course, the legends of the Holy Grail sort of emerged kind of out of the Crusades, but really the pot shots that Monty Python takes is more on that Crusades culture. And when you hear some of the real life stories that are going on, it will reflect that. So it's just, please, just as a way of, we do have to laugh in some respects, because if you don't, we're going to But at the same time, there were always counter movements going on during this period of time. So I'm going to try and find the little beacons of light through that, knowing that the Crusades is a very dark period of our history, and we have to acknowledge it. So, anyway, any other questions? Thank you very much.